Welcome everyone. Happy Pride. My name is Ben Clary and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Equalizers, which is APM MPR's employee resource group for LGBTQIA employees and allies. We strive to create a supportive and inclusive space for people to bring their whole selves to work. We're very excited for this event and the upcoming discussion with Sasha Geffen about their new book. But before I bring on Jay Gabler, my colleague, to introduce himself and Sasha, I just wanted to bring up two items. The first is we will be placing in the chat function several links. One of them will be to bookshop.com to purchase Sasha's book if you haven't done so already. We highly recommend it. The other two links will be to local nonprofits working with the LGBTQ community here in the Twin Cities. So one of them is Reclaim, which works to increase mental health access to queer and trans youth in and around the Twin Cities. And the second is Black Visions Collective. They are committed to a long-term vision in which all Black lives not only matter, but are able to thrive. Throughout the development of powerful strategic campaigns, they seek to expand the power of Black people across the Twin Cities metro area and in Minnesota. The other housekeeping point to mention is that the Q&A function will be open. So once I introduce Jay, Sasha's going to read for a little bit, and then Jay and I have a couple of questions. But then we highly encourage you to ask Sasha any questions you might have, particularly about something they've written in the introduction or anything that you're curious about related to the topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jay Gabler, to introduce himself and our guest, Sasha Geffen.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I'm Jay Gabler. I'm a digital producer at The Current. Part of my job is to do the Rock and Roll Book Club. That's every, let's say every Wednesday morning at 8:30, I should remember it, 8:30 Central Time. I hop on The Current with Jill Riley and talk about a book related to our playlist. And we call it the Rock and Roll Book Club, review it online. And we've never done anything quite like this before, a Q&A like this with an author of a book. And I can hardly think of a better author and a better book to feature than Sasha Geffen with their literally beautiful new book, Glitter Up the Dark. So I just want to thank Ben and all the Equalizers so much for creating this space for this discussion to happen. Sasha is a writer based in Colorado. Their work focuses on the intersections between pop culture and gender, and that work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, Art Forum, The Nation, and The New Inquiry, among others. Sasha, welcome so much. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be chatting.
Yeah. So we thought we would start out by treating this kind of like a book reading, like as though we're cozied up among the stacks in a bookstore and invite Sasha to read a passage from the book.
I miss bookstores a lot.
Yeah.
Someday we will be back among the stacks. But yeah, thank you. I'd like to just kind of read from the intro because I feel like it sums up a lot of my thinking around the thesis, so to speak, of the book. So I'll just go ahead and do that.
Great.
Thanks again. All right, so the intro I subtitled An Alternate Ribbon of Time, which is taken from a Perfume Genius song from his third album. Cool. The gender binary cannot really be broken because the gender binary has never been whole. It has always limped along in pieces, easily cracked by a brief foray into the historical record. The Christian colonialist construction of men as inseminating subjects and women as reproductive objects does not extend into ancient history, nor does it govern every facet of the present. Masculinity and femininity, so much as they refer to certain strategies for moving through the world, have never neatly corresponded to the two types of bodies defined in the opening passages of the Bible. Even human bodies don't hold true to the popular myth of strictly dimorphic sex, as anyone in the intersex community can tell you. So the subtitle of this book is misleading, or rather it only holds true when viewed through a limited lens. There have always been more than two genders, and music and gender nonconformity have gone hand in hand since long before pop music emerged as a product, since before the concept of product existed. But the patriarchal order, in order to survive, needs to brand threatening ideas as artificial, superimposed, harmful, and new, so as to distract from the underlying truth that patriarchy itself is artificial, superimposed, harmful, and not nearly as ancient or universal as it pretends to be. Hardly the natural order of the human being, patriarchy relies on the illusion of its own inevitability to survive. The notion that only two genders exist and that each gender prescribes specific behaviors, movements, and relations has always been undercut by a thriving spectrum of deviant expressions that white capitalist patriarchy seeks to erase. When European settlers devastated the Americas, they, quote, looked to the existing sexual and gender variants of indigenous people as a means of marking them as racially inferior and uncivilized, a justification for a forever unjustified genocidal conquest, end quote, wrote Michael Paramo. During the era of American slavery, white men and women similarly clung to the gender binary to distinguish themselves from the racialized people they were brutalizing, stamping out expressions of gender that didn't fit into the white Christian patriarchal mold as part of a long campaign of hellish state-sanctioned violence. The gender binary, which seeks to clearly label who can get pregnant and who can't, who should have power and who shouldn't, has served white supremacy for as long as white supremacy has existed. But cross-dressing, homosexuality, and fluidity of form sparkle throughout history. It's just that the powers that be still need the binary to persist, to keep cis white men in charge and cast aside everyone else. And so they rigorously shutter the light that leaks in from just outside their cage. Music shelters gender rebellion from those who seek to abolish it. In music, drag is not an aberration, but a form of play. Women can sing with masculine bravado, and men can adopt transcendent femininity, poses that were often dangerous to display offstage and outside the recording studio for people of all genders. Drag queens such as Julian Eltinge sang in vaudeville revues to broad acclaim while homosexuality was still illegal in the United States during the first decades of the 20th century. Queer, trans, and gender nonconforming artists similarly populate the history of blues, R&B, jazz, and rock and roll. There's no pop music without artists who reveled in lashing out against the gendered expectations levied on them from on high. The blues as a cultural product begins with Gertrude Ma Rainey, the Southern singer who in 1923 signed a record deal with Paramount and soon became famous throughout the United States for her powerful, androgynous voice. Her friend and collaborator Bessie Smith, who had auditioned for Rainey's band in 1911, similarly became a star after signing to Columbia Records. Both women were Black and queer, and both sang about lesbian love via barely coded lyrics. Rainey's song Sissy Blues also playfully celebrated feminine gay men. My man's got a sissy, his name is Miss Kate, he shook that thing like jelly on a plate, she sings. In pre-war America, major record labels were willing to sell gay records so long as they came from Black women, whose voices and presences already deviated from mainstream norms. Quote, the blues songs recorded by Gertrude Rainey and Bessie Smith offer us a privileged glimpse of the prevailing perceptions of love and sexuality in post-slavery Black communities in the United States, wrote Angela Davis in 1998. Both women were role models for untold thousands of their sisters to whom they delivered messages that defied the male dominance encouraged by mainstream culture. The blues women openly challenged the gender politics implicit in traditional cultural representations of marriage and heterosexual love relationships, refusing, in the blues tradition of raw realism, to romanticize romantic relationships. They instead exposed the stereotypes and explored the contradictions of those relationships, end quote. Rainey and Smith, along with fellow blueswoman Lucille Bogan, set the stage for pop music's tendency to incubate androgyny, queerness, and other taboos in plain view of the powers that would seek to snuff them out. They were joined by Gladys Bentley, the Stone Butch blues singer who performed in a top hat and tails throughout the Harlem Renaissance in New York, and whose deep, gritty voice foreshadowed the guttural howls of rock stars. In 1938, the gospel guitarist Sister Rosetta Tharpe laid her music to tape for the first time at age 23. Throughout the following decades, she would develop a style of playing electric guitar that would influence generations of rock musicians to come. Tharpe, too, was queer, and she adapted a phallic symbol of masculinity, the electric guitar, to her own gender-breaking whirlwind of a stage presence. Quote, in that day, it was still unusual to see a woman guitarist in gospel or in any musical field, wrote Gail Wald in a 2007 biography of Tharp. Not merely to play, but to wield the instrument with authority and ease was to subvert convention and expectation, end quote. Tharp was doing the windmill on her guitar while Pete Townsend of The Who, the white man with whom the gesture is most commonly associated, was still learning to walk. Reach back further in time and you'll find a long and varied history of third, fourth, and other alternate genders, people who slip between the poles of the Western binary, often in keeping with musical and ceremonial traditions. Among Indigenous Americans, two-spirited individuals manifest both male and female qualities. In India, third gender hijras, who recently won the right to their own legal gender marker, appear in ancient sacred Hindu texts such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. In Bolivia, the China Supe, a devil character historically embodied by trans feminine performers, plays a key role in the Carnaval de Oruro festival. Contemporary electronic musician Elisa Crampton dedicated her 2018 self-titled album to Ofelia Espinoza, quote, one of the mariposas or butterflies who forever altered the costume of the China Supe in the 1960s and 70s, the Aymara femme devil performed by queer and trans bodies in the street festivities, which, though now formally Christianized, can be traced back to before the conquest, she said in a 2018 interview. These identities only mirror the contemporary model of trans when viewed through a colonial lens. Within their original context, they do not mark a journey from one gender to another, but are natural and frictionless ways of being in their own right. Many disruptive gender identities have deep ties to music. In Italy, for hundreds of years, a third gender was biologically created for an expressly musical purpose. From the 16th century until the early 20th century, castrati sang in a third voice, neither male nor female. Castrated before puberty so that their voices would never drop, these singers paired the unthickened vocal cords of the soprano with the deep lung capacity of the baritone, resulting in a distinctively androgynous vocal quality. Quote, although the pitch may have been similar to that of a female, the timbre of the voice was different, wrote J.S. Jenkins. In 1799, a French music critic, quote, described the castrato sound as being as clear and penetrating as that of choir boys, but a great deal louder, with something dry and sour about it, yet brilliant, light, full of impact, end quote. For centuries, these voices were popular in opera and in Catholic choirs, though the practice of creating castrati was outlawed in the 19th century as industrialization and its attendant social values swept Europe. The figure of the castrato and the invention of music recording technology briefly overlapped. Only one castrato was ever known to make solo recordings. The last surviving Sistine castrato, Alessandro Moreschi, recorded a handful of songs on wax cylinders in 1902 and 1904. The recordings are remarkable. Moreschi's voice, reportedly past its prime at the time, has a coarse, rippled quality to it. He hits soprano notes with a guttural grain. The texture of his voice, combined with the ghostly quality of the recording, lends a spectral aura to the music. Moreschi does not sound like a combination of male and female vocal traits, but like a supersession of the gender binary altogether. The availability of musical playback devices surged at the same time that the last of the castrati died. Recorded music, played at first within the inner sanctum of the home, severed the voice from the gendered body. The gramophone had no perceptible gender, and while commercially sold music often reinscribed conventional gender roles, it also frequently dismantled them. In his 1993 book, The Queen's Throat, Wayne Kostenbaum theorizes a connection between the proliferation of recorded music and the articulation of homosexuality with its associated androgyny as a social category. Quote, the category of homosexuality is only as old as recorded sound, he notes. Both inventions arose in the late 19th century and concern the home. Both are discourses of homes shattering, what bodies do when they disobey, what bodies do when they are private, end quote. Well, that's about 10 minutes, and I like ending with Wayne. I thought I would get through the whole intro, and I only got through about half of it, but I think that's a pretty good place to stop.
It gives people a motivation to pick up the book.
There you go.
See where it goes from there. Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah, so Ben and I will have a few questions for Sasha, and if any of the rest of you here in the webinar have questions, drop them in the Q&A function in the bottom, and in about 15 minutes or so, we'll start perusing those questions and move some of those questions forward to the author. But I get the great privilege of asking the first question. And I thought I knew what it was going to be. I thought I have my list of questions here, but as you were reading, I was like, no, I got to ask this. No, I got to ask that. No, I got to ask this one. All right, so here's where I landed for now. So you write a lot about the role of technology, synthesizers, and you just talked about just basic recording technology, the ability to separate the sound from the person creating the sound. You write throughout the whole book about the liberating potential of technology, which is a way of thinking about technology in music that is different than another way of thinking about technology in music, which is that technology is always artificial and bad, right? If you think about like the MTV Unplugged era in the 90s, right? The thought was like, okay, now we're getting the pure, stripped down, the real essence of Eric Clapton, you know? So I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about that, about how for any performer who is looking to break that binary, technology has been positive or liberating force.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny that you mentioned like MTV Unplugged, because obviously television is still a technology, and those performers are still using microphones, and like even acoustic guitars are still technology. I mean, there's really no contemporary human practice that happens without technology. And I think you see a lot of that backlash kind of around the time when more marginalized groups are starting to use technology in like new and provocative ways. I mean, around the time that MTV Unplugged became a thing, hip hop was the dominant social force and was a technological innovation, and had been, for like 20 years at that point, but like was really kind of dominating the mainstream. And so you have a group of like somewhat reactionary programmers like taking it back to the real thing, which no samples, nothing pre-recorded, just like live performance, which is no less technologically aided but has different codes associated with it. So I think you see kind of throughout the history of pop music, every time that there is a new technology that comes to the surface, there's a backlash, right? Because the dominant order has already kind of metabolized the last wave of new technology, and they're like wanting to maintain their mastery over the language of music. And so as soon as like new vernacular pops up, the first reaction is to be like, well, that's not important. Like, don't worry about that. Like, worry about what we've already mastered. And then like 10 years later, you see, all that getting digested, all the new stuff getting digested, and it being treated as though it was like naturalized, as though it was always part of the mainstream conversation. So it's just this cycle that kind of happens over and over again. And you see that with, with synthesizers, with vocoder, with auto-tune, all these things that were at first provocative and strange, and now are pretty much normalized, and no one really, I mean, I guess there are still people in like YouTube comments who are like, this is real music about like electric guitar bands as opposed to like synthesizer bands, but it seems to be a minority, or at least like kind of a vestigial like crop of listeners. It seems like most people are like, yeah, the synthesizer is just like something you make music with, it's like on the computer that you use for everything else. Like, it's not a big deal anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the Unplugged series as being reactionary in origin. You think about, oh yeah, sure. It's like, here's who gets to like come through, thread this needle. It's the Roots. Look, the Roots and Jay-Z, they're a live band. See, we're not discriminating here. It's just we can only have people who play real instruments. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Well, there's so much to unpack. Like Jay, I'm having trouble deciding which question to land on. But one thing that I thought was really productive in the introduction is you described strategies for disrupting the gender binary and pushing it back against the strictures. And you emphasize those over, say, like identity. So at one point you talk about, say, Bruce Springsteen in the song State Trooper incorporating this scream from Alan Vega. So I guess my question is, why strategies? And what does that tell us about how we are kind of engaging with the ideas around gender binary right now? What is so productive about thinking about strategy instead of identity?
I mean, just for the purposes of like criticism and analysis, I think it having like a more granular approach was a little bit juicier for me, like looking at the life cycle of this like particular vocal affectation and like where it came from, where it went, what it did, as opposed to like how does Bruce Springsteen identify? Because I think with identity, you kind of get a little bit locked up in ultimately capitalist modes of like sorting people. Um, and I think also like I've interviewed a lot of artists, and when you try to press them on vocal strategies in particular, about like why does your voice sound like it does in this particular moment in this particular song, like it's really hard to get like a solid answer. A lot of artists are just kind of like acting on what feels good. And so I think it's interesting to look at like what feels good in certain moments to certain people, and what finds its way into the mainstream and how listeners kind of engage with it. So there's also the fact that there are other books already on just like sort of identity focused history, like David Bowie Made Me Gay by Daryl Bullock. It's a great book that just kind of looks back at the past 100 plus years of LGBTQ plus identifying musicians. But I found identity to be limiting in part because just queer communities and queer spaces have such a long and rich history of identifying with music that's not necessarily made by queer people, and in many cases made by people who are like vocally opposed to gayness, at one point or another. Like Donna Summer is an example of someone who kind of like disparaged her gay fan base at one point and was like had a kind of Christian worldview, but whose voice was just so enlivening on disco dance floors. So I think just looking at the connection between artist and listener and the kind of queer play that can arise there is more interesting to me than looking at how artists identify, because I don't think you have to be queer to make something that can resonate with queer people.
For sure.
When I talked about the book on air on Wednesday morning, I felt like I had to start by explaining that to the audience, that this isn't, this isn't like the book you mentioned, David Bowie Made Me Gay. This is not a history of, non-binary performers, right? It's exactly what you just said. But I'm interested in talking a little bit more too about the process you described, the iterative process where something breaks the mold, and then the mold, the gender binary, kind of tries to pull it back and force it back into that, as you say, corporate white supremacist structure. And specifically with respect to this moment that you mentioned in the book, and we at The Current have thought is such a fascinating, terrible moment, that 1981 concert where Prince opens for the Rolling Stones. Famously, the last time Prince ever agreed to open for anyone, because there he was at Mick Jagger's invitation, and you would think that the Rolling Stones fans would get into Prince, but no, they booed him off the stage, with homophobic, racist intentions. It was just awful. But as you write in the book, Mick Jagger had himself, been a gender bender, in his youth, and even as his style of presenting masculinity is not what the norm was, when he started out. But yeah, how is it that the ways in which masculinity changed in rock in the 60s got reabsorbed into the mainstream, so that by the 80s, now the Rolling Stones are just like this corporate band that feel completely, normatively masculine mainstream?
I mean, I think once something hits a certain critical mass, it is seen and like received by mainstream audiences enough times that the shock wears off, right? It's just kind of like any, you know, cycle of human learning. Like you see something new for the first time and your first reaction is like shock, you know, either positively or negatively. But then you see it over and over and over again, and it just becomes normalized. It becomes boring almost. And I think by 1981, the Rolling Stones had become boring in some ways. Like not that their music was bad. Like it just, what I mean is that they had become mainstream where, you know, in their earliest iterations, they were kind of probing at the edges of what was acceptable in the mainstream, and like wearing dresses on stage and having long hair and things that seem very innocent now. And even the Beatles did this. You know, a Beatles haircut doesn't look like anything now. If you see a teenage boy walking down the street with hair like mine, you know, with like a little bit longer than like a military issue cut, like it's like whatever, it doesn't register anymore. But in 1963, that was shocking, that was obscene, that was unacceptable. So, and I think it comes down to kind of the mechanics of capitalism and what happens when people in power realize that they can profit from something that's exciting, that is pushing boundaries, but not too many boundaries. You know, it's like just provocative enough to get people excited enough to spend their money, right? And in the 60s, it was about getting teens to spend their money, largely in the 50s and 60s. So yeah, you see that line happening over and over again where, you know, artists who are completely provocative and aggressively provocative don't necessarily get assimilated into the mainstream because they've staked out a position that is too antagonistic to be digested. But, and artists who are just kind of like reiterating what's already come before, like they might get pulled into the mainstream, but they're not going to necessarily be like the superstars of, you know, the era. But artists who find a line between those two things, who kind of bring enough safety and enough danger, will have a moment of, you know, breaking molds, and then will kind of ride their popularity to the point of like reiterative boredom, which is, I think, what you see happen with a lot of dad rock bands like the Rolling Stones. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just, it kind of is what it is. And by 1981, the Rolling Stones had become codified. And I think they, you know, had specifically become codified as like white, straight rock performers, which is why people saw Prince and were like, excuse me, like, I don't know what this is, and I don't have a place for it in my worldview, so I'm going to react with violence.
Thank you.
So at one point in what you read from the introduction, you talk about how the gender binary really serves white supremacy. And I think one of the really striking threads that runs throughout the book is just how much at the forefront Black queer musicians have been, not just in terms of pop music and pushing it forward, but also in terms of subverting the gender binary. So can you unpack a little bit more just how white supremacy and the gender binary are kind of tied together? And yeah, that thread that kind of runs throughout.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic. And I would say if anyone's like interested in reading more on that intersection, see Riley Snorton's book, Black on Both Sides, is a great read to pick up, just about how race and gender are so deeply intertwined, because gender in this country and in other countries and like other, you know, white supremacist countries is racially coded. Like femininity specifically is racially coded in a way that you see happening kind of all the time. I'm thinking about like athletes, you know, like Black female athletes who are forced to take hormone tests and like forced to undergo like non-medically necessary treatments to like reduce their testosterone, like just people who are seen as like not feminine enough to be competing in women's sports, which is like obviously like a deeply racist and misogynist practice. So that still happens, and it has roots in really just the beginnings of capitalism in property. If you think about, the idea that like whiteness is hereditary and like needs to be preserved under white supremacy, it makes sense that you need to codify white cis women in a certain way. It's like these are the people who have bodies that produce more white people. So I think that is kind of like the roots of that, but it's a big subject. It's a form of logic that undercuts, the whole genocidal project of the United States, and there's a lot of history there that doesn't really fit in a Zoom webinar, that I encourage other people who are interested to seek out.
So Rose actually sent a follow-up question in chat, our colleague Rose Martin. And she is curious to know your views on what role music, musicians, and artists can play in dismantling white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism moving forward. Of course, they have played a role that's part of the book. But how do you see that playing out moving forward?
I mean, I think that music offers a space for imagining realities that kind of lurk just outside our own. And so in the works of a lot of Black queer musicians and other queer musicians of color, you kind of see these universes bubbling up temporarily, within the course of like a music video or a concert. These realities happen. And I think spending time in these imaginative spaces is really productive for anyone who's invested in dismantling white supremacy. It's similar to how reading and studying is like essential work for kind of reprogramming yourself. And I'm speaking as a white person. Like it takes work to learn all the super subliminal practices that get encoded into you when you're very, very young. And it's something that you kind of have to like do every day and keep doing, because it goes like way below the surface of like your everyday conscious mind. Like it's really insidious. It's really deeply rooted. And I think that just kind of, spending time in other people's realities as they create it can be a productive way. And for people who share, racialized identities with those artists, I think it can be, not to speak for anyone besides myself, but I think that can be a way of like reinforcing the mission as it stands, a way of like seeing yourself reflected. At least like this is how music videos have worked for me as like just a transmasculine person, like seeing other transmasculine and like trans artists play, especially in music video spaces, but also just in the music itself, like hearing vocal play, hearing instruments that sound like they're in a reality that's just quite like just a little bit removed from this one where things are a little bit looser and more fluid and freer. Like that is all really productive and exciting stuff. So I think musicians have an important role to play, especially right now, just in terms of like imagination and like feeding imagination, because there's like so much of the work ahead is psychological and creative. Like we need ideas from people. We need like ways of relating to each other that are less toxic and less violent. We need all that stuff to happen. And I think music is something that binds us to each other, that allows us to kind of explore each other's worldviews in a way that's a little bit more visceral and more subliminal than like the written word or just like having a conversation. I think it has a lot of active potential. So yeah, I think just imagining and pushing forward. I would recommend, if I'm like speaking to musicians, I would recommend that like white queer musicians, you know, do their best to amplify their Black peers right now, and like maybe think about how much space has already been devoted to like white queerness over the past, you know, 50 years, really, since the beginning of the modern gay rights movement, which was, you know, originated from Black trans people, with Black trans people who rioted against the police. Just kind of like remembering that history and looking for ways to lend voices like in support, and not necessarily like, you know, speak for all queer people, because like that's not something that white queer people are capable of. Like our needs are different. Our goals should fall in line with those of us who, you know, are most harmed by white supremacy.
I will ask the bookstore question. If we imagine ourselves to be in a bookstore surrounded by shelves, one of the de rigueur questions I would have to ask is, tell me the story of how this book came to be. This is your first book, I understand, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you decide this was going to be the subject of your first book?
Well, it was what I was writing about anyway, so I just decided to do more of that. But I don't know. I got an invitation from Jessica Hopper at the University of Texas Press, um, and she was like, "Hey, are you sitting on any book ideas? Like, I'm, you know, soliciting pitches from writers I know," and that just kind of like set me thinking, like, if I was going to write a book, like, what would it be about? And I was like, why not just, you know, what I've been thinking about, but at length, like where, because I'd been writing about a lot of like trans artists and queer artists, and kind of looking at how their use of music subliminally articulated identity in a way that I found really powerful and exciting. And I was like, what if I look at the roots of this? Like, what if I go back to kind of the beginning of pop music and see like how this practice originated, and kind of go from there. And my original proposal was actually like way longer. It would have been like twice as long of a book, because I wanted to go back to like the 19th century and like the very beginnings of like drag balls and like vaudeville and all these, you know, pre-recording, or pre like I guess wide distribution of recorded music, all these ways of celebrating queerness in performance spaces. And then I wanted to do like a deeper dive into blues and all these kind of originating practices. And my editors at UTP were like, okay, like this is too much. You're not going to be able to like get as all that juice you want in the word count we've allotted to you if you try to, you know, spend this much time, if you try to span this much time. So I started with the middle of the 20th century and kind of went from there. And they were right in that, you know, there already has been kind of like scholarship done on early pop music practices. There is writing on that. The Angela Davis quote from the intro is also a great book to read. Her book on blues musicians, like it's already there. It didn't really need my take on it. So I just decided to focus on, you know, the Beatles onward, effectively.
Yeah. So when you read criticisms, like I think maybe the harshest criticism I've seen in this book is that it's just too short. It could have been twice as long.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. But it was not in the contract or in the cards,
Yeah.
which is okay.
Good in there, yeah.
You know, you mentioned that, and I thought I would read that book. So that's a long book.
Yeah.
Following up from Jay's question, you know, I'm kind of curious about the way research happened for this book, because in the acknowledgements, there's this really cool line where you acknowledge the kind of anonymous fan archivists who have just uploaded all of this history to the internet. And it's such a strikingly kind of different image of what you expect kind of scholarship and research to look like. Has this given you a new appreciation of fandom? Did you expect that type of information to be out there in that form? And do you find any kind of similarities with how queer archives, especially early on, were being formed by the people right there kind of in the moment?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because a lot of what I quoted comes from queer archivists. Like there's a website called the Digital Transgender Archive, which has a huge collection of these niche publications that were, being put out in the 20th century. There were all kinds of like, cross-dresser and transsexual magazines where, trans women in particular would kind of post for photo shoots and give interviews about what their lives were like. And it was like for the trans feminine community at the time where there wasn't really any mainstream acknowledgement beyond the occasional article of like, oh my goodness, this person like transitioned, like, and that's where I was able to read Wendy Carlos's coming out interview with Playboy. That's where I got just a lot of contemporary historical documentation of trans existence in the mid-century, because there's not a lot in the archives of mainstream publications. It was seen as kind of this niche like strange phenomenon, like kind of like a Ripley's Believe It or Not sort of thing. Like, can you believe that some people are trans? Like, who knew? Which is very different, from the way things are now. And, so many of us are like rigorously self-documenting and publishing in a way that is like very, very open. So yeah, there's that. There's also like wonderful musical fan communities that, go through their own like personal archives of fanzines and magazines that aren't archived very well anywhere else on the internet or off it, and they just kind of scan them and transcribe them for free out of love for the band that they like, out of love for Alice Cooper or Throbbing Gristle or whatever, The Cure, just all of that. And I guess I wanted to point to the larger issue that a lot of what makes the internet worthwhile is the work of people who don't get paid for it, who actually, pay for the privilege of like doing this labor. They pay their ISP to have access to their own personal libraries. And it's just like a really broken setup and has been broken from the beginning, like this is maybe tangential, but I don't think that, companies like Comcast should exist, should have power over, the ways in which we archive and share information. So yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to all the people who did work that made this book possible, who are not otherwise acknowledged or compensated for their labor.
It's this kind of wonderful utopian almost shout out to a way something that can be kind of outside of what normal gatekeeping looks like, whether that's in academic archives or quote unquote professional scholarship.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
So this is a painful subject to pivot to, but it's very present in the Twin Cities right now. We had a sort of rehearsal for this yesterday, and I was mentioning to Sasha at the time, I was a little distracted because we've had a lot of revelations of abuse and manipulation in the Twin Cities music scene, with women, non-binary individuals being victimized by men. And today I was talking with some colleagues about Prince, and you think about, here's an individual who, as we described, was targeted and harassed because of his gender presentation, and of course also because of his race. And then at the same time, you know, based on the accounts of some women who worked with him and were in personal relationships with him in some cases, you know, he also engaged in some manipulative behavior towards them, even you could say some emotional abuse. And it's just all true. And I wonder if you would, you know, feel able or interested in reflecting on what was going through your head when writing this book and thinking about how there's this, you know, violence that goes along with the gender binary, this gendered violence, and how, you know, breaking down the binary has hopefully helped to, I don't know, alleviate some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky question because obviously abuse can happen among people of any gender, and there's a lot of same-sex abuse that happens. Um, but I think that as long as we are suspended in an inherently violent system, which is, you know, white supremacist patriarchy, abuse will trickle down, so to speak, to the individual level. Like capitalism is not really good for anyone, in my view, the way I see it, because it forces us to kind of think of our value in like monetary terms, and it kind of distracts from the inherent value of every person, and it's also dependent on the disproportionate exploitation of women and other marginalized genders and racialized people. So as long as we're in this, it's going to cause people to harm each other, I believe. And I think that I think about violence not as, you know, an individual act that someone like chooses to inflict against another person. It's more like a network. It kind of passes from person to person, you know, like someone's abused as a kid and then goes on to abuse other people in order to feel a sense of control. Like we have a sense roughly of the psychological underpinnings of this kind of behavior. And a lot of it starts in the nuclear family and in school and in these closed systems that harm kids more than I think a lot of people are willing to talk about. Like, I think like there's a lot of talk about, you know, putting more money in education, and like obviously like education should be resourced, but I think we also need to think about like how do we rethink education so that it doesn't harm kids, especially, you know, Black kids and other kids of color, especially queer kids, because like I think a lot of people can tell you like school is really kind of inherently traumatic if you don't really fit the model of what an idealized American subject is supposed to be, if you don't have that future curled inside you of like a productive capitalist subject. And I think the nuclear family, like the idea that you're kind of restrained within this household and it's like a closed cell as opposed to, you know, living in a way that has been proposed by a lot of Black women thinkers. Like Toni Morrison has a great quote about how families could look if we kind of thought outside of the nuclear family, like, you know, how it doesn't necessarily need to be a problem that teen girls are getting pregnant because they can still go to school, like because they if they had a whole network of people to support them, of like other women and other marginalized people to support them, like they could have kids and still become, you know, physicists if they wanted, like if they wanted. So I think those are two structures that engender a lot of harm because of the way that they are kind of enacted in this country and in this society. And that, you know, it kind of passes over to music. And maybe maybe this isn't an answer to what you were asking, what I've been saying, but but I think in music specifically, you see, you know, the prioritizing of the power and well-being of men or people who are, you know, considered to be male. And women often do a lot of work behind the scenes in the music industry and in music communities, just as they do a lot of work for little to no compensation in domestic spaces and in educational spaces. So I guess it's all kind of linked where, you know, whatever step away you are from the American ideal of like white cishet masculinity, you'll be doing more work, you'll be credited less for it, you'll be the recipient of like more exploitation and harm. So yeah, it kind of happens all across the board. And we are seeing more reckonings with that now, and we have been over the past few years. And I think, you know, what's going on with rhymesayers right now is just kind of like the latest iteration of a trend that's been building, where the people who have been exploited are not content to be quiet about it anymore and are kind of trying to bring justice to themselves and their communities by airing out, you know, a lot of toxicity that's been running through the whole music industry, because it all runs on exploitation, and it has from the very beginning.
A question, Ben, or?
Seems like a little bit of a sharp pivot, but Julia mentioned, not a question, just a note. I would totally read a book that delves deeper in history / aligns with your original pitch. Please keep us in mind if you tackle that project in the future. So I guess a lot of calls for volume 2 of Glitter Up the Dark.
The prequel to Gutted. Yeah, I mean, I would, if you have the book, I would go through and look at some of the books that are cited in the footnotes or endnotes, I guess they are, because there's a lot of that history that has already been written. There are biographies of a lot of these pioneering blues women, like that history is there. It has been written, and yeah, I would really recommend looking up that history, because it's great stuff. It's like the history of rock and pop music is so much more interesting and juicier than I think it commonly gets credit for.
Well, and to go out on a hopeful note, with just a few more minutes left here, the book ends on a hopeful note. You say, you know, things are not, the world is not perfect, never has been, but it does feel like that there's some real change happening, that you're seeing visibility for artists that has not been there before, and acceptance and enthusiastic embrace. Could you talk for a couple of minutes about what you're seeing in terms of hopeful change around artists who are breaking down the binary?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there are so many artists right now who are kind of speaking from positions that have not necessarily been given like the highest pedestal in the past or the loudest megaphone. A lot of trans artists are kind of coming up and being openly trans and making music from an openly trans perspective for not the first time, but I think the volume is new. The fact that there are so many that you can like book a show that's, you know, 100% trans women is pretty cool. Obviously, there have always been trans musicians in music history, but I think it used to be a lot harder to kind of gain that foothold. So I'm also seeing right now, you know, in the wake of the protests that started in Minneapolis, a lot more calls to have more Black people, not just, you know, on the stage, but also behind the scenes, and running record labels and running, you know, venues and event nights. And a lot of the people that I'm seeing kind of doing this work already are Black queer people. So I think that there has been a lot of like breakage this year in terms of like what is suddenly a mainstream topic. The fact that there are like mainstream calls for abolition is really cool, for like abolishing the prison system and abolishing, the police. Like that's the fact that that's like now a New York Times opinion piece is pretty cool. That's something that I see reflected in music, where there are like a lot of artists doing benefits for like bail funds, and speaking openly about the problems that are endemic to the music business. So yeah, I think it's not, there's a long way to go, and I worry that all of these topics are just going to be like kind of paraded out by like the same people who are still in charge, and like touched on and then kind of like brushed aside, like cool, like we talked about it, like time to go on with business as usual. And I hope that people keep pushing until we really do see the toppling of the power structure as it stands. But I am seeing more of that, I think, than before.
Well, thank you so much. We are right about at 3, just a few minutes up against 3. So I think we will say thank you. Thank you for the book. Thank you for your time today. And thanks to Ben and all the Equalizers for creating this space today.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Rose Martin and Nora Doherty, Tom Campbell behind the scenes. So don't forget, in the chat, there's the link to get the book. Please go out and get it. It seems like there's a lot of excitement for finding out more. So I hope you have a chance to read it. And then if you want to donate, Black Visions Collective or Reclaim. So happy Pride, everyone. And thanks again to Sasha.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure speaking with y'all.